In early 1843, the 23-year-old Friedrich Engels began taking daily walks through the English city of Manchester, usually accompanied by Mary Burns, a young factory worker who would later become his companion. These walks were not undertaken for romantic purposes nor for personal enjoyment. The pair instead chose to walk through the poorest slums of the city and carefully record their observations. Although Engels had been sent to Manchester by his father to work in a family-owned cotton manufacturing business, he was now living a double life. By this time, Engels had become convinced that the Industrial Revolution and the capitalist system that supported it were fundamentally immoral and socially unjust. He hoped to chronicle the depth of the suffering he witnessed on his walks with Mary, and then to turn his observations into a public call for action. A year later, Engels published a groundbreaking book entitled The Condition of the Working Class in England. Perhaps the most powerful passages of this book described the wretchedly poor housing conditions he and Mary had observed along the River Irk in the centre of Manchester. Everywhere half or wholly ruined buildings, some of them actually uninhabited, which means a great deal here, rarely a wooden or stone floor to be seen in the houses, almost uniformly broken, ill-fitting windows and doors, and a state of filth. Everywhere heaps of debris, refuse, and offal, standing pools for gutters, and a stench which alone would make it impossible for a human being in any degree civilized to live in such a district. In Engels' view, the economic elites of the city had intentionally walled themselves off from the victims of industrialization and cutthroat capitalism. The town itself is peculiarly built, so that a person may live in it for years and go in and out daily without coming into contact with a working people's quarter, or even with workers, that is, so long as he confines himself to his business or to pleasure walks. This arises chiefly from the fact that, by unconscious tacit agreement, as well as with unspoken conscious determination, the working people's quarters are sharply separated from the sections of the city reserved for the middle class, or if this does not succeed, they are concealed within the cloak of charity. Engels' intent here was to shock the conscience of social elites both within Britain and across Europe. He was determined not merely to chronicle the social conditions of the poor, but to actively campaign against capitalism, the economic system that he believed was responsible for those conditions. Engels' book was widely discussed in England, but it was even more popular on the European continent. There, the book impressed a young Karl Marx, who, although only 2 years older than Engels, had already developed an international reputation as a political radical. In 1843, Marx had been forced to resign as the editor of the German newspaper Rheinische Zeitung after repeated conflicts with political censors. He would spend the next several years moving around Europe and developing contacts with a small group of like-minded intellectuals, including Friedrich Engels. Like Engels, Marx had not been born into a working-class household. However, his radical activities had estranged him from his own family and placed him in financial difficulties. In the future, Marx would often rely on Friedrich Engels for financial support. But Engels was far more than Marx's benefactor. The two men would develop a close partnership that lasted until Marx's death in 1883. In the first years they worked together in the mid-1840s, both Marx and Engels joined a secret society called the League of the Just, Bund der Gerechten, that was determined to fight for economic and social reform. By 1847, this group had changed its name to the League of the Communists, and Marx and Engels had become leading figures. Later that year, Marx and Engels set out to write a manifesto of the party's ideas, which was published in early 1848. This Communist Manifesto, as the document eventually became known, is perhaps the most influential single piece of political writing in the last 2 centuries. A few additional points may be helpful in putting the Communist Manifesto into context. 1. When the manifesto was published in 1848, the League of Communists was not a mass political party, but a relatively small group of intellectuals. Also, Marx and Engels were young men of 29 and 27 years old respectively, and they were still working out the details of what would eventually become a complex political ideology. Thus, if one reads the manifesto hoping to find a detailed description of how a communist society should work, he or she will be sorely disappointed. Although readers can certainly see the outlines of Marxist ideology beginning to take shape, the core of the manifesto is primarily a searing critique of capitalism and a direct answer to critics of communism who had tried to label the movement as radical, immoral, and dangerous. 2. It is often assumed that Marx and Engels' primary audience was the European proletariat, industrial working class. This is not entirely inaccurate, however, one must remember that Europe in 1848 was much different than it would be in 1900. A few urban pockets of England and Germany were rapidly industrializing at mid-century. The remainder of the continent, however, was still predominantly rural. In other words, a true urban industrial proletariat was still a small minority of the population in 1848. This would be true for several more decades in England and Germany, and well into the 20th century for the rest of Europe. Who then was Marx and Engels' intended audience? Certainly they hoped to reach members of the proletariat both present and in the predicted future. However, they undoubtedly also aimed to win over political radicals of all stripes and disaffected intellectuals across the social spectrum. 3. At this time the manifesto was written, the terms communism and socialism had much more complex connotations than they do today. For much of the early 19th century, communism had been used to describe the extreme egalitarianism linked to the most radical phase of the French Revolution. It did not necessarily refer to a desire for an oppressive central government, nor to a rejection of democracy. Socialism was an even more complex term. At the time they wrote the manifesto, Marx and Engels were seeking to distinguish themselves from a host of other, more established socialist theorists, including Charles Fourier, Richard Owen, Louis-Auguste Blanqui, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. One can see these efforts most prominently in Part 3 of the Manifesto, where Marx and Engels take great pains to differentiate their ideas from other brands of socialism that they label as reactionary, conservative, or utopian. The Manifesto, then, is not simply a critique of capitalism, but also an appeal for readers sympathetic to the plight of the lower classes to adopt a particular kind of socialist outlook. 4. The Manifesto was published during a turbulent time in Europe. A half-century after the French Revolution, Europe was once again dominated by conservative monarchies that permitted little dissent or public participation in government affairs. Just weeks after the Communist Manifesto was published, the revolutions of 1848 began in France and Italy and quickly spread across much of the European continent. Although the various revolutions of 1848 were eventually suppressed, at the cost of thousands of lives, Marx and Engels did not lose hope. They instead came to believe that the working classes of Europe were simply not yet sufficiently prepared for a successful revolution. Eventually, they suggested, further uprising against European elites would come, and their eventual success would be impossible to stop. There is a legitimate question that human experience students occasionally ask at this point. Why should anyone read the Communist Manifesto today? After all, if we survey the various political regimes across the 20th century that claimed to follow Marxist principles, we find some of the most oppressive governments in human history, including the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong, and North Korea under the leadership of the Kim family. These regimes not only dramatically limited individual freedoms, they also tortured, imprisoned, starved, and executed tens of millions of their own citizens. Why then return to a document that helped inspire such regimes? It might also be added that Marx and Engels were clearly wrong about the impending collapse of capitalism. Why waste our time on a text that was so fundamentally mistaken? First of all, many scholars would argue that it is not necessarily clear that the communisms of Stalin, Mao, Fidel Castro, or Kim Il-sung have been entirely consistent with the ideas laid out in the manifesto itself. Even during his own lifetime, Karl Marx railed against politicians who sought to distort his ideas and claim his legacy, even going so far as to tell leading French socialists in the 1880s that if they were Marxist, then he was not. If oppressive communist regimes later used Marx's name, his likeness, and his writings to justify oppressive policies, it is still entirely debatable whether or not the young Marx and Engels of 1847 would have approved. What Marx and Engels describe in the manifesto is not the eventual replacement of one form of class oppression with another. They instead claim that a world after a socialist revolution would be one in which all humans are free. As they put it in the Manifesto, in place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. One might disagree thoroughly with the author's analysis, their conclusions, and their policy prescriptions, but there is still little reason to doubt the honesty of the ideals they expressed within this work. Second, the Communist Manifesto is more than just a piece of political propaganda. Marx and Engels present here a complicated view of history that describes social and cultural developments primarily as a product of economic relations. In claiming that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, the authors outlined a new model of human history that placed economic exploitation and oppression at its centre. Regardless of one's political views, it is impossible to deny that Marx and Engels' historical analysis of social relations has been enormously influential over the last 250 years. The Communist Manifesto itself is divided into 4 sections. The first, entitled Bourgeois and Proletarians, examines the history of class struggle into the modern industrial age and the development of 2 primary contending classes, the bourgeoisie, factory owners, and the proletariat, unskilled workers. The second chapter, Proletarians and Communists, is a spirited defense of the communist movement against commonly made criticisms. The final 2 chapters compare the nascent Communist League to other existing socialist movements, and then the manifesto ends with a call to action. One last point before you begin your reading. The purpose of including the Communist Manifesto as a reading assignment in this class is not to indoctrinate you into Marxism, any more than assigning the Mencius later in the semester is an attempt to indoctrinate you into Confucianism. Reading and engaging with the manifesto does not mean uncritically accepting all of its ideas or arguments. What the manifesto offers us is a critique of a society and economic system the authors believed was fundamentally unjust. To what degree are the criticisms of capitalism offered by Marx and Engels still accurate, or at all relevant to us? To what degree would the reforms they recommend produce more or less justice? To what degree are their proposed remedies naive, impossible, unnecessary, or undesirable? The answers to all of these questions are left for you to decide.